cooking at this restaurant for years. It's a nice spot, and the kitchen's my domain. Now, don't get me wrong, cooking all day for strangers is one thing, but it's different when I bring food home for my wife and kids. We've got two little ones, my son who's 8 and my daughter who's 6, and honestly, I love making dinner for them. Every single night, I wrap up work, pack up some good stuff, and bring home a hot meal for the whole family. This has been our setup for years. I handle dinner during the week, and on weekends, my wife steps in and takes over. It works for us. She does breakfast and lunch on weekdays, so we both have our thing, you know? It's not like we ever made a big formal arrangement, but it's just the routine we settled into, and it works. Well, it was working just fine until recently. Anyway, last Friday, my wife had a few friends over for a little girls' night at our place. I'd already had a long shift, but I didn't want to break tradition, so I packed up dinner for the family as usual. And when I got home, I joined in for a bit before heading to bed early. That's when her friend Stacy, who's got a way of being blunt, started asking my wife questions about who does what around the house. And she wasn't subtle. She was like, "So, does he ever actually cook for you? Or is he one of those husbands who just cooks at work and thinks his job is done?" Now, I was half expecting my wife to step in and set the record straight, right? Because it's not like I'm some guy who just sits around when I'm home. I make dinner every night, even if I've had a busy shift. But instead of saying, "Oh no, he actually brings dinner home every night," or something like that, my wife kind of laughs it off and goes along with it. Like, she just made some joke about how I'd rather leave the cooking to her when I'm home and how I never cook. That got Stacy going, and she starts telling this story about her ex-husband who was, according to her, the laziest man alive. She goes on and on about how he never lifted a finger around the house and how she had to do everything herself. And the whole time, my wife is sitting there laughing along, nodding her head, and going, "Yeah, it's so hard to get him to cook at home." Just throwing me under the bus like I'm some lazy guy who never does anything. I didn't say anything then because, you know, they're having their girls' night and I didn't want to make it weird. But I'll be real with you, it really bugged me. Here I am spending every evening after work getting food together for everyone, making sure my wife and kids have a nice dinner. I even make different things sometimes because my wife likes one thing and the kids might want something else. So yeah, it hit a nerve when I'm hearing them joke around like I'm just slacking off, especially coming from my wife. Like, what was the point of that? I went to bed early that night trying to shake it off, but it just kept gnawing at me. It was like the more I thought about it, the more annoyed I got. I mean, why wouldn't she just speak up? I get wanting to keep things light with friends, but I don't think you should do that by making your spouse look bad, especially when it's not even true. The way I see it, your partner's supposed to have your back, not join in when someone's making fun of you, even if it's all just a joke. Next morning, I figured maybe she'd bring it up or, I don't know, maybe realize she put me in a bad spot. But nope, nothing. She acted like everything was totally normal. So I waited until after breakfast, once the kids were out of earshot, and brought it up. I said something like, "Hey, last night when you guys were joking about me not cooking, that kind of stung. You know I cook dinner for us every night. Why would you just laugh along and make it sound like I don't?" And she just looked at me like I was making a big deal out of nothing. She goes, "Oh, come on, it was just a joke. I didn't think you'd take it so seriously." But it's not just a joke when it's your partner, you know? Like, here's someone you love, who knows all the things you actually do, yet they're sitting there acting like you don't. I tried explaining that it just felt disrespectful, and that it made me feel like all the effort I put in every day didn't matter. I thought she'd get it, but instead, she doubled down. She said she was just trying to keep things light, and that she didn't want to make it awkward by defending me in front of Stacy. She was acting like I'd asked her to pick a fight, when really, all she had to do was say, "Actually, he does cook. In fact, he brings dinner home for us every single night." But nope, apparently that would have been too awkward. She told me to just let it go and stop being so sensitive, which honestly just added fuel to the fire. I tried to stay calm, but it was pretty clear we weren't seeing eye to eye on this at all. At that point, I didn't really know what else to say. Felt like whatever I said was just going to bounce off. So I let it go, at least for the time being. The next day, I went to work, and I decided I'd actually follow through. I still brought food home for the kids because I didn't want them to get caught up in this, but I didn't bring anything for her. I figured if it's really no big deal, then she won't care, right? When I got home that night, I could see her eyeing the takeout bags, clearly expecting her share like usual. And when she realized there was nothing for her, she looked at me like I'd grown a second head. She goes, "So you're really not bringing me anything now?" I just shrugged and said, "Well, you don't think I cook anyway, so I figured you wouldn't mind handling dinner yourself." Her face went red and she was clearly annoyed. She muttered something under her breath and headed to the kitchen to make herself a sandwich. I could tell she wanted to argue about it again, but I think she realized I wasn't in the mood to keep going in circles. Over the next couple of days, I stuck to my plan. I'd come home with food for the kids and nothing for her. Each night, she'd give me that annoyed look but wouldn't say anything. It was a quiet but tense standoff, with her clearly waiting for me to break. And honestly, a part of me was hoping she'd just get the point and realize that maybe I wasn't being so unreasonable after all. But every night, it was the same. She'd make her own food, shoot me that look, and we'd go to bed without really talking. At one point, I wondered if I was dragging it out too far. But then I'd remember how she'd laughed along with her friend, acting like everything I do didn't matter. That frustration kept me going. Finally, one night, as I was tucking the kids in, my son asked, "Dad, how come you're only bringing food for me and sister? Doesn't Mom want any?" Kids, man. They pick up on stuff faster than you'd think. I didn't want to drag him into it, so I just said, "Mom's making her own food this week, buddy." He looked confused but didn't press it. It's funny because I felt kind of petty, but at the same time, I didn't feel wrong. I'd tried talking to her, tried to explain why it bugged me, and she just brushed it off. I felt like this was the only way to make her see I was serious. Things were tense. We both did the usual routines with the kids, acting normal enough in front of them, but the second they weren't around, it was like we were both ignoring each other. I kept expecting her to try and talk about it, but she just kept doing her own thing. It was like we were both too stubborn to make the first move, and neither of us was going to back down. Then came Sunday morning. Normally, weekends are her cooking days, but this time she just sat in the kitchen, sipping her coffee and scrolling on her phone like she was waiting for something. Finally, she looked up at me and said, "So, you're just going to sit there and not help at all?" I knew where this was going, but I figured I'd play along a bit. "I thought you'd be happy to get a break from all my non-cooking." That really set her off. She put her coffee down and finally came out with it. "You're being really petty. You know that? You're dragging this out way too far just to make a point." "Maybe I wouldn't have to make a point if you just apologized instead of brushing it off," I said, keeping my tone as calm as I could manage. "I don't get why that's so hard. All I wanted was for you to say you're sorry for making me look like a deadbeat in front of your friends." She stared at me for a moment, and I could tell she was actually thinking about it this time. Finally, she let out a sigh and said, "Fine, I'm sorry. I'm sorry if I made you feel like you weren't doing enough, but it's really tiring having to cook for myself after a long day. I don't know, it's been hard too." Part of me wanted to just accept it, let things go back to normal, but another part of me was still irritated. "You know, I do this every night after work. It's not exactly easy for me either." She nodded, looking a bit more defeated this time, and said, "Yeah, I know, I didn't think about it that way." We stood there in silence for a minute, both of us just kind of lost in our own thoughts. It was weird because I could tell she was starting to understand, but at the same time, she wasn't fully there yet. Then she goes, "Look, I get that you're upset, but are we really going to keep this up? I don't want the kids to feel like there's something wrong between us." She had a point there. I didn't want the kids picking up on our tension, and I definitely didn't want to keep dragging this out, but it was also hard for me to just let go after feeling like I'd been thrown under the bus. So I told her, "Look, I'll bring you dinner again, all right? But I need you to get why this bugged me so much. I'm not just being petty for no reason. I work hard, and I want that to mean something to you too." She nodded, finally looking like she got it. She didn't say much, just gave me a small, quiet, "I'm sorry." And for the first time in days, it actually felt real. I could tell we still had stuff to work out, but at least we were getting somewhere. One night, after I put the kids to bed, she'd cleaned up the kitchen without me having to ask. Another day, she texted me at work to ask what I felt like eating that night, which was pretty much her way of saying, "I'll take care of dinner." It's funny, but those little gestures meant a lot to me, and I appreciated that she was making the effort to make things right. But of course, things couldn't stay that smooth forever. On Thursday, her friend Stacy showed up unexpectedly. I'd just gotten home, was unpacking the food, and boom, there she was at the door, like she was the ghost of awkward conversations past. Stacy came in with her usual big energy, laughing and making small talk with my wife as if nothing had happened. I kept my cool, but I'll admit I was a little on edge just seeing her. I had no clue if my wife had told her the truth yet or if Stacy still thought I was this guy who never cooked. Then, out of nowhere, Stacy starts up again, saying, "So, has he finally picked up a spatula at home yet?" She said it like it was the funniest thing in the world, giving my wife this expectant look, as if they were both in on some hilarious inside joke. I looked over at my wife, wondering if she'd let it slide again, but this time she actually stepped up. She cleared her throat, gave Stacy a little smile, and said, "Actually, he brings home dinner for us every night after work. He's been doing it for years." There was a bit of an awkward pause as Stacy looked back and forth between us, clearly caught off guard. "Oh, I didn't know that," she said, her tone a bit thrown off. She let out a weird little laugh and quickly moved on, talking about something else. I didn't need her to apologize or anything, but just hearing my wife correct her like that felt like closure. I could see my wife had finally got it, and she was showing me that, even if it was a bit uncomfortable for her. After Stacy left, my wife came over and leaned against the counter, kind of fidgeting with her phone. "I wanted to make sure she knew the truth this time," she said, almost like she was explaining herself. I smiled and said, "I noticed." It felt good to see her follow through, and I think she knew that. Later that night, while we were getting ready for bed, she brought it up again, this time a bit more open about how she was feeling. She told me, I've been thinking about how I handled things with Stacy. I didn't realize it, but I guess I was kind of embarrassed to tell her how much you actually do. It's like I felt this weird pressure to fit in with her experience, even though it wasn't true for us." I didn't totally get why that was a thing, but I could see she was being honest, and that was all I really needed. I told her, "I appreciate you saying that. It's just that, to me, all the stuff I do, it's not just for show. I want to be a good husband and dad, and it sucks when people think I'm the opposite." She nodded, saying, "I get it now. I'm sorry it took me so long." I didn't push it further because, honestly, that was enough for me. We both had a bit to learn from this, and I could see she was making the effort to meet me halfway. Later that night, when we were winding down, she turned to me and said, "I know I've said it already, but I really am sorry. I shouldn't have let that joke with Stacy go like that. You do a lot for us, and I never want you to feel like it goes unnoticed." I didn't have much to say in return. I just thanked her and said that the whole situation made me realize how important it was to feel seen in our own home. We're not perfect, but I feel like this whole thing brought us a little closer, helped us both understand what we want from each other. Since then,